So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to what will be the final faction showcase as we take a look at the third Arnorian petty kingdom, ARTHEDAIN. And ARTHEDAIN, just like Rune in my opinion, are the jack of all trades of the Reforged world, and like Rune they make probably the best learning tools for new players because they aren't really exceptionally weak in any area really. In fact, quite the opposite in certain cases. They certainly have very strong options when it comes to infantry, cavalry, ranged cavalry and footbound ranged units as well. We'll go through their units individually and we'll talk about this as we go. They obviously do have quite a lot in common with other good kingdoms of men as well, because they take some of the same sort of design philosophies into account. However, like all of the other Numenorian inheritor factions, they also have access to the trebuchet, so the siege equipment does have something unique about it as well. Obviously the trebuchet is more likely than the catapult and the ballista as well to be seen only in siege battles, because it is quite unpredictable with how it can be used, but of course potentially very, very damaging and of course very long range. Of course they also have access to the catapult and to the ballista over here, but then this is not really anything new. All of the Numenorian inheritors are basically the same. However, now we shall get on to the infantry, in which ARTHEDAIN does take on a bit of an identity of its own in certain areas. However, the civilians, of course, they are something that they share with most of the other good kingdoms of men, including Rohan, Gondor and Dol Amroth. Of course, really you're only really likely to see the civilians if there's a bit of spare cash left over and your opponent wants to bring them, or if you want to be sneaky and put your general in here because they're so cheap and then you can just keep them out of the fight, but of course don't expect them to do much with their pitchforks and their shovels. However, we also have the Hobbits, and of course the Hobbits are something which ARTHEDAIN have all to themselves now that Cardlin have become somewhat a different entity to what Eriador used to be. And the Hobbitry and arms are, again, I suppose, just like the Dwarven Miners, they are a shock infantry militia, although I would be a little bit more reluctant to call them shock infantry as such, mainly because their charge bonus is still so low, but they are effective against armour because they do two-hand their, I don't know, there are some cross spears in there and there are some what looks like small glaives. They aren't farming implements at the very least, but yeah, obviously in melee they're not going to be that great. They've got a very low defensive skill, very low armour, no shield values. They're going to be dumpstered by pretty much anything. But the AP can help in certain situations, and there are of course quite a lot of them at 253. This makes them, I think, the joint biggest unit in the game. So yeah, just don't expect them to do too much heavy lifting, but they aren't quite as useless as they first appear based upon their stats. A unit that you're much more likely to see, however, will be these lads over here, and that is the Aventine Spearmen. And they form, essentially, I'm sure that anyone who's seen my videos for any length of time will be familiar with the idea of a phalanx formation where you have pikes and then you have some cheaper spears as well to add some mass to them. And ARTHEDAIN's phalanx is very, very useful. It's alongside Cardlin. It's a very similar sort of scenario there between both the two factions. Definitely a big similarity that they both share. However, the Aventine Spearmen are better than the Cardlin equivalents in melee. They still have a decent shield value, and honestly, based on the fact that they are technically wearing shorts, they have a decent armor value as well. They won't kill that many, honestly, with only an attack of 3, and they of course have that spear malice to take into account as well. But honestly, the Aventine Spears are a very common pick to see as ARTHEDAIN because they are such a decent all-around pick. Very easy to be cost effective with a unit that only costs 300 and has got stats as decent and versatile as this, because of course as spears they can also make shield wall, and they have a bonus fighting cavalry, which is always good. So yeah, they are definitely a unit which you will often see quite a lot of if you're facing ARTHEDAIN, and if you want to bring a balanced composition, the Aventine Spearmen can either be used on the flanks, obviously, to ward off enemy cavalry, or at the front if you want a cheap front line and you want to spend your money elsewhere. Then, however, we shall get on to the middle, and continuing the phalanx line of thought, we have the other part to such a strategy, and that will be the Pikemen. And the ARTHEDAIN Pikemen are, again, sort of your more basic pikes. They are a little bit better, I think, than the Cardlin equivalents, the Greenwatch Garrison Footmen. Some of these guys don't actually have faces by the looks of things, but hey. The ARTHEDAIN Pikemen can also have their armour upgraded by 1 level, so this of course will make them just that little bit more durable in the face of arrow fire. So of course this actually has the effect of ratcheting their armour up to 9, which for a basic pike unit is very good indeed. You would have to go to the more expensive pikes in order to get a number like that under normal circumstances. 163 men in the unit. Obviously their stats seem relatively low, but as we discussed before, with pikes that doesn't really matter because they keep the units at arm's length with their phalanx formation, obviously a bonus fighting cavalry. Again, I would suggest this is probably going to be quite a common unit for ARTHEDAIN because they do have some very nice cavalry and archers that they will often like to bring on a field battle. And these pikes are honestly not that expensive to bring as a pretty cost-effective front line. In conjunction with the Aventine Spears, there's a lot of good unit synergy there. And having the ability to upgrade the armour is also very nice as well. Some of them have got chainmail faces still. Very spooky. Then we move on to a unit which is more reminiscent of Gondor than anything else, because we have the ARTHEDAIN men-at-arms, which are of course similar to most of the other good kingdoms of men line infantry, but the Gondor infantry in particular for one reason we'll get onto in a moment. Their stats are honestly not terrible, but they're nothing really to write home about either. It's very similar to all of the other very similar units. So we have 550 for each unit, and of course you can mass them up relatively easily. So if you think you're going to be engaging in a little bit more of infantry to infantry fighting, then you might want to bring these guys ahead of the Aventine Spearmen, for example, paying that little bit more for a little bit more effectiveness in infantry combat. But you can upgrade them 2 levels rather than just 1, so this is something which is very reminiscent of Gondor. You can start off here, effectively increasing their armor value to 9 with just the breastplate, and then you can upgrade them all the way to the full plate, which I think has the effect of ratcheting up to 11. So again, I don't think they're quite as tanky as the Gondor infantry, but it is a similar situation here. And of course, ARTHEDAIN are a little bit less infantry focused than Gondor in general, who rely on it a lot more. So that's not too surprising, but you have a very similar unit here which can do very similar things. Obviously very tanky, going to be very good at absorbing arrow fire, and of course very good at holding the line against non-AP units as well. And then we have the spear variant. Now interestingly enough, there is only one variant of this, and that is the full plate right from the off with an armor value of 9. So of course they have that recruitment cost of 600, they can fight cavalry as well. So essentially if you think that you want to have a little bit more of a tanky spear, you can't mass them up quite to the same extent that you can with the Aventine Spear. So this is going to be much more if you want to protect your flanks from cavalry, that sort of thing, rather than blanketing your front line with just Faunus arrayed defenders. And obviously their attack is low as well. They have exactly the same attack as the Aventine Spears with the same malices as well. So if you think you want a more tanky spearman, then this might be for you. Also in a siege battle, of course, for plugging up choke points and adding their mass to things, they can also be quite good as well. But do beware of armor piercing units, because armor piercing units will love fighting heavily armored spearmen like this. And then the first variant of the two-handed swordsman that ARTHEDAIN have is the mercenary war chiefs, of course, a unit that they share with multiple other factions. They are the cheaper of the two, but they do still cost 725. Now they do have an attack of 11 and a charge bonus of 10, so that's pretty decent. But do bear in mind the slightly lower morale that mercenaries tend to have, and the fact that there are only 138 per unit as opposed to the 163 per unit that all the other units on this tier tend to have. So mercenaries can be used to plug a gap in your army, but do bear in mind that getting cost efficiency off a unit this expensive with this kind of stats can be a bit of a challenge. However, ARTHEDAIN do have their own variant of a two-handed swordsman as well, a human swordmaster unit, which is the Dismounted Knights, which cost only 75 more honestly, and they have significantly better stats, they have better attack, but it's in the defense obviously where things start to get a little bit better with that armor value of 9. Good defensive skill, no shield of course, they can still be quite vulnerable to enemy arrow fire, but again, this is the sort of unit which is going to be similar to the Abrazanim Narduzagar or the Kerandros Swordmasters or Swordmasters of Karnan. All of these units are very similar, will do very similar jobs, and obviously this means that ARTHEDAIN have got a very good unit with decent skill and decent damage potential that they can use to embed in their lines into some of their lesser units and give them a bit more damage, which is always nice. And then we have another spear unit, previously known as, well, it is actually still known as the Doudna Peacekeepers. And the primary difference here between these guys and the spears we've already seen is going to be the attack. Obviously, previously the spears we saw only had 3 attack. The Doudna Peacekeepers have got 10. They've got higher defensive skill as well. Lower armor, significantly lower armor in fact, so they can be a little bit more vulnerable potentially to arrows. But the higher skill and the higher attack, it's a very Dunedain sort of approach to things. They go for skill rather than their armor, a little bit more elven perhaps in terms of how they go about their business. Expensive for spearmen though, so do bear in mind that while all this is well and good and you get a much higher attack and the spears can sort of act as de facto infantry as well, even with the malice, do bear in mind that they are quite expensive, so they don't have multiple HP anymore either, but obviously they still have that bonus against cavalry, and they have that all of the other good trimmings that that make a unit like this what it is. And then another similarity to Cardland is going to be this sort of higher tier pikeman, and that is going to be the Numinous Gate Guards, obviously very similar to the Wardens of Tir and Gorthad from Cardland. And you know, again, it's going to be a unit which inspires the troops around it, which is very similar to the Wardens of Tir Gorthad as well. Again, these stats maybe don't look too good in comparison to regular units, but for pikemen these are very good indeed, particularly the defensive values. That armor value of 10 is very good. Wearing these guys down from the front is going to be very difficult without any sort of range support. And honestly, the attack value of 8 is good for pikes as well. They're going to be able to poke their way through units quicker than most other pikes will be able to. If you just have a look at the standard pikes, for example, that's the whole 3 attack points less, which is pretty significant in the current version of Reforged. Attack rarely goes into the 20s, for example, like it used to when there was a bit of a stat bloat. But yeah, very good sense to your line, because obviously they can keep your lower tier units in check with that inspiration, and of course they can have their flanks secured in exchange for this. And now, the only unit actually which could count as a general's bodyguard tier unit for ARTHEDAIN on foot are going to be the Dismounted Knights for Numinous, of course, previously known as the Dismounted Knights. They've been a holdover ever since vanilla. They've always been one of the tankier infantry units in the game, and so it shows here. They've got a good attack for a sword and board unit, but it's the defense which is where the really heavily armoured ARTHEDAIN Knights come into their own. So of course they've got an armor value of 10, defensive skill of 14, shield value of 9, hit points of 2 of course, it costs 1200 as well. These are stats which are relatively similar actually to the Carmel's Chosen from Rune. And you might be thinking that maybe these guys should be better than the runic Carmel's Chosen. However, you can have 2 before the cost increases, so they are similar to the Talon Knights in this respect, only they are stronger than the Talon Knights even. So it does show that ARTHEDAIN maybe have got a little bit more of a focus here. But also, unlike Dol Amroth, of course, they don't have an equivalent to the Haven Knights. This is the only real multiple HP infantry unit that they have, but to make up for this, they do have some very strong units in other areas. Their archers and cavalry have got some very good units within them, so we shall now move on to that section of their army. So, as I'm sure you can see, we have quite a few units to get through here, and obviously this shows ARTHEDAIN's versatility. They certainly have strengths in all areas. We'll start off with a somewhat unique unit actually, and that is going to be the Hobbit Slingers, which for all intents and purposes I suppose are javelin units. I mean, they are stone throwers, similar to how it worked in the first movie when they were backing up Boromir. Obviously they have a very low missile attack, however it's only a missile attack of 2. Very low stats. They are very cheap. They do have effectiveness against armour, however, which is why I suppose they are javelin units. I've seen them used in the past. I haven't really seen them enough to really give my full opinion on them, but they are so cheap that I suppose if you've got the money to bring them, you might as well give them a try. But obviously don't really expect the world from them. If anything, just picture them as slightly weaker versions of Snaga skirmishers, I suppose, which you know, seems to be a fair assumption based on the kind of stats that they have. However, we shall now move on to the archers, and again a somewhat popular pick are going to be the Aventine Marchers, and the reason for this, obviously, again, very similar to most other low tier archers, is going to be their ability to get a lot of low tier value downrange in as much volume as possible. Now the difference between these guys and some of the others is perhaps they do have a little bit more in terms of individual tankiness, with a shield value of 2. Their armour is low, of course, because again they're the short swearing variant here. But also one of the things which maybe puts them at a bit of a disadvantage compared to factions which have a little bit more of a focus around lower tier units is going to be the fact that they only have 163 men in the unit, whereas a lot of other low tier archers, including the Greenwatch Garrison archers, crest 200. So do bear in mind that if you're going for a skirmish heavy approach, you can't just rely on your low tier archers like you potentially could with some other factions. You're going to need to back the Aventine Marchers up with some more archers of genuine quality if that's the way you want to go. But other than that, they will still get the job done. They are very cheap at 450, so you can get, you know, this won't really be too much in a way of invasive into your budget. Moving on, however, we have the other, well, I think the final Hobbit unit we're going to be looking at, question mark? Yes. We have the Banderbrass Archers. Now the Banderbrass Archers are quite interesting because I feel as though most people, if they don't look at their stats, will overlook them, but you really shouldn't, because again there are 202 men in the unit, which for an archer is very good. But the primary thing here is obviously they've got relatively low stats in melee, but not quite as bad as you might think. But also missile attack of 6. I mean, this is the sort of thing you expect to see on pretty high tier human archers most of the time. I mean, for the most part, for an archer that costs 600, you'd be looking at an elven archer to get a missile attack of 6. So this is actually a much better unit than many people give them credit for. Maybe a little bit of a glass cannon, because they are kind of easy to skirmish with their low armor values. But even so, they can add a surprising amount of punch considering the kind of unit that they are. Don't discount the Banderbrass Archers, because they can do quite a lot of damage quite quickly. But of course, you will need to back them up, because individually in a skirmish fight they might struggle a little bit. But even so, that's kind of the story with all of Arthedain's skirmish line. You're going to need to use more than one type of archer unit if you really want to get the most out of them. Speaking of which, we have again the sort of standard centre to any human archer line, the heavier archers. We have the Arthedain Marksmen, which again, higher armour values, decent sort of... I suppose the missile attack of 5 is fairly standard as well. I mean, the Gondorians, the Umbarim, all of those have got a missile attack of 5. You can also upgrade the armour 1 level, so it's not quite as tanky maybe as something like the Gondor archers. Again, we can see the chainmail faces. Good unit. You know, obviously, when it comes to Arthedain, you're going to need to use them if you want to engage in any sort of elongated skirmish fight, because the Aventine Marchers or Banderbrass archers alone won't cut it, and this is obviously going to be the ideal unit to back them up with, because individually of course they're a little bit tankier with their higher armour values. Only 143 in the unit though, so do bear that in mind moving forwards. Now however, we have a unit which we have seen before within Cardland, and that's going to be the Doudna Rangers, so obviously identical. They will do exactly the same job, and as I've said, this is going to be the final time that I repeat myself with regards to the Rangers, because this is of course the final faction. Missile attack of 5, but the body piercing means that is in effect much higher. Decent melee stats honestly, with a melee attack of 11 and the defensive skill of 11, but you know, they aren't going to win you any significant fights in melee all on their lonesome. But obviously it's really their range which gives them their appeal in bringing them in their army. Going to be a common unit though, I feel, because Arthedain can utilise them very well with the kind of compositions that they can bring. And then we have, again, a somewhat unique unit, the Dunedain Troll Slayers. Obviously good melee stats, melee attack of 20, which is armour piercing of course, because they bring out their two-handed axes in melee. Very good javelin attacks as well with their missile attack of 9, which is armour piercing. Low armour score, however. The unit that I would compare them most to, I suppose, despite being very different in many ways, would be the Etten Moors Troll Hunters from Rudour. Mainly because they are pretty good in melee. Those guys are armoured spearmen, however, whereas these guys are more lightly armoured shock infantry. So just bear in mind the strengths and weaknesses of that sort of relationship, and you'll know what the Dunedain Troll Slayers are good at. They will be very good at chewing their way through armoured line infantry once they're out of ammunition. So you can use them potentially to kill off an enemy cavalry unit and then charge them into the infantry fight to tilt that in your favour as well. Very good unit, very good all-purpose unit, but they are very expensive at 1050, and there are only 73 of them. They are multiple HP however, so they won't be able to be destroyed quite so quickly as you might think by arrow fire, but they can also hide anywhere, so very good unit. And then finally, we have the Wardens of the North, which again are one of the 3 armour-piercing archers in the game, alongside the Temple Guard from Mordor and the Blackshot Dragon Slayers from Dale. Very similar unit to those two. They are very strong in melee as well, because they are technically two-handed swordsmen in melee. I think, however, they have slightly lower stats in melee than the Temple Guard, a little bit more comparable maybe to the Blackshot Dragon Slayers. They're effective against armour at range, of course. They can inspire nearby troops. Very, very good all-round unit. In fact, in most cases, I would suggest on an open field and potentially in a siege, this may very well be the General's Bodyguard for Arthedain, because it is such a good all-purpose unit. The only other one in an open field will be the Knight unit, which we will get onto in just a moment. But still, the Wardens of the North are a very, very strong unit. Obviously, armour-piercing archers in general were always very strong in the various versions of Reforged. And now that it is a distinction which only 3 units have, it becomes that little bit more valuable. So a very strong unit here in the Wardens of the North. Now Arthedain do have a very strong cavalry corps as well, which is, I suppose, arguably it might be one of the stronger aspects of their army, because Rune do have maybe a little bit more fragility here, whereas Arthedain have got so many units that they can cover for each other's weaknesses a little bit better. Starting off with the Arthedain Sergeants, these are the sort of entry-level Lancers, obviously with only a charge bonus of 5. It is armour-piercing, but obviously they are the cheapest cavalry unit by quite a long way. Quite a lot of men in the unit, however, at 93. Similar to the Doran Ernil cavalry from Dol Amroth, you purchase them mainly for the amount of men they have in the unit and how cheap they are, and the fact that they can still potentially do a lot of damage, but don't expect them to win any significant conflicts in a one-to-one engagement, because you know their stats for a melee cavalry unit chew through the Arthedain Sergeants. Moving on to the next one, we have the Faunus Knights, the mounted variant. Of course, we saw the dismounted variant with their two-handed swords earlier. Again, this is going to be a charge bonus of 10, so you know how the increments work at this point with the cavalry. They're going to be just slightly better in terms of stats, but the charge bonus is going to be the most significant thing here with their effectiveness against armour. They can form wedge as well, which is always nice bit of utility there. and of course you can upgrade the armour of them here as well to make them look that little bit nicer. Next we have the the mounted Dunedain company, which again, in terms of a cavalry unit, they actually have less armour, so it's not just a straight increase in terms of all the stats across the board this time, but just having a look between them, so they do have slightly more defensive skill. They've got the same sort of shield value, however, but again the main thing here is that they have a higher charge bonus. They also have more men per unit, so that could potentially come into things, but a charge bonus of 15, which is armour piercing, is obviously very, very powerful, and that's going to be the primary reason why you bring this unit. Now, moving on, another sort of comparison you can make to Rune here is that they have a knight unit and a multiple HP lancer. Starting off with the multiple HP lancer, we have the Royal Court of House Armlaith, which could be viewed as similar as well to the Royal Court of House Thorondor from their neighbours Cardlin. Total defense of 29, decent armour value, good defensive skill, charge bonus of 15, armour piercing of course, can inspire nearby troops. Again, if you keep a multiple HP lancer moving, they will be able to do a lot of damage over the course of a long battle very well, but again it is quite micro intensive, because if a melee cavalry unit does catch up with them, their multiple HP will help them, but they're not going to be anywhere near as cost effective as spear cavalry or melee cavalry. Speaking of which, we also have this, we have the Knights of Numinous, which actually, interestingly enough, all of Arthedain's cavalry up to this point has been lancers in a very similar vein to Rohan. So this is, again, a comparison you can make to Rohan. The fact that, you know, the only melee cavalry, dedicated melee cavalry unit that they have that's effective against other cav in melee is their knight unit. The Knights of Numinous, I believe, are the knights with the thickest armour. Armour value of 10, again. I would say they're very similar to the Carmel's Dragon Knights, more so than the Sons of Yall. Obviously they cost 1500 like most knight units do. Multiple HP as well, obviously they have all the trimmings as well. Frighten nearby enemy infantry, inspire nearby troops, bonus fighting cavalry, effective against armour, charge bonus of 20, very, very strong. If it's not the Wardens of the North heading up the Arthedain army, then it will probably be these guys, because they are so powerful. Very, very good, obviously still a holdover for vanilla and still looking as good as ever. Arthedain also have 2 units of horse archers to choose from. Now they aren't as tanky as others, they are, you know, in fact with their armor value of 3, this is a unit which you can skirmish with very, very easily, so maybe a little bit more of a micro intensive horse archer that we have here. Wait, what am I doing? Oh, that was the wrong unit. We'll get onto those in a minute, but again they look basically the same, the 2 units anyway. But the Dunedain Scouts, the thing that you buy these guys for is the missile attack. Missile attack of 7 is going to be better than most other horse archers, but do bear in mind that they are glass cannons in this regard. Foot archers are going to very easily be able to zone them out because of their very low armor values and of course no shield value. And they are quite expensive, so they aren't the sort of unit you can just throw away unthinkingly, like you can potentially do with some of Khand and Rohan's lower tier horse archers. And then we have a unit which is similar to a Harad unit in the mounted Hashari. We have the Grey Company, which are of course rangers on horseback. They have a missile attack of 5, but that is body piercing. They can also hide anywhere, even on horseback, so if you want a ranger that's very quick, then the Grey Company is going to be for you. Only 900, so only a little bit more expensive than the Dunedain Scouts before them. Yeah, I mean, they are potentially very devastating, but this is a little bit more situational because people will be on the lookout for them and they will try to zone them out if they see them. But potentially if you hold them back to the late game when they don't have any archers to answer them with, then the body piercing can be devastating. So, with all of that said, we'll head back to the army selection screen and we'll talk about what I think of Arthedain, which are of course the final faction that we're going to be looking at. So just a cursory glance over these as well, you can see obviously Hobbitry and Arms have got relatively low morale. As we move up into sort of the middle tier, we have a morale of 12, which is fairly standard fare for most of the Kingdoms of Men. And obviously as we get up in there we can see morale of 19 with some of their higher tier units. That's generally how it will work. Arthedain's morale is not infallible. You will need to use some inspiration to keep some of your lower tier units in the fight, particularly against fear causing units. But for the most part it won't be as big a problem as it would be for their neighbours in Cardlin. What do I think of Arthedain? Well, it's hard to hate Arthedain because they can do basically anything and they're pretty good at most things. Obviously I've said before that they and Rune are probably the best learning tools for new players because they can do basically anything. You can build whatever kind of army composition you want and it will be decently effective most of the time. You may have heard as well as I was going through the individual units that I was making numerous comparisons to other factions. Obviously with all of these lancers there's a bit of a comparison to be made to Rohan. With the Grey Company there's a comparison to be made to the Hashari of Harad. with the Dismounted Knights of Numinous to Dol Amroth, obviously with Gondor, the standard infantry back here. It is, well, and obviously Cardland as well with the potential phalanx that you can make. So there is a lot of other factions which ARTHEDAIN can draw inspiration from, and the fact that they can do all of these things just adds to their versatility. And it's for this reason that I do like them. I do prefer playing as other factions other than ARTHEDAIN because I do prefer a little bit of specialisation personally. And you could argue that ARTHEDAIN's archers and cavalry are where their specialisations lie, but ultimately with most of these things, you can also make the argument that if you really wanted a skirmish-based faction, you would go for maybe sort of Mirkwood. If you really wanted to go archer heavy, or if you wanted to go a little bit more solid, you'd go Dale. Cavalry, you'd probably want to go Rohan or Khand over ARTHEDAIN 1-to-1. But it really is their versatility which gives them their strength. And I would argue that if you are a completely brand new player, that ARTHEDAIN might even be the best place to start, maybe even slightly more so than Rune, because Rune, they are a little bit maybe leaning on the AP side of things, whereas ARTHEDAIN don't really have to worry about that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, overall, there isn't really much else to say about ARTHEDAIN that I haven't said already about every other faction, because there's so much that is similar to other factions that I can't really find anything too unique to say about them. But regardless, this is going to be the final faction showcase for the time being. And honestly, I'm not sure what I'm going to do next. I maybe do some top 10s, or at least some top 5s, if not top 10s, based on, depending on how things go, we'll see. But it's likely that for the time being, the videos will maybe slow down for a bit. But I'll make a separate video on that, maybe a channel update or something, just to let people know what's going on. But regardless, this was the final faction showcase for now, at least until any potential new factions poke their head over the trench. And yeah, I hope you found this and all of these somewhat informative with regards to picking a faction that you want to be. And yeah, I hope you'll join me for whatever is next, which will probably be another battle replay at this point.